president said the private sector is doing fine, and I would argue that he's free to say that, but he's really revealing that his standard is the state of Illinois. If Illinois' economic performance is your worldview, then you can maybe make the argument that things are fine, but when Illinois has more per capita debt than any state in the union, when Illinois has raised taxes and failed to close a budget gap, when other states around us are well governed and are poised to come in and actually are competing and taking jobs out of Illinois, when our unemployment rate in Illinois is higher than the national average, and if you're a president from Illinois, then you perceive the private sector is doing just fine. It's not, and I think the rest of the world has figured that out. I think that there's a great deal of concern about the direction that Washington, D.C. has been going under the president's leadership, and Illinois plays a pivotal role in Nancy Pelosi's drive to become Speaker of the House again. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee Chairman Steve Israel said that the pathway for the Democrat majority is to go through the Illinois redistricting process, not through the Illinois voters or not through anything else, but through the Illinois redistricting process. And now the Illinois redistricting situation is old news, but I think what's interesting about it is I think we're going to see Illinois congressional candidates overperform on election day, and that is Illinois Republicans that are going to come through in large part because they're running within the context of a state that is being miserably run, and it has been miserably run by one party for quite a long time. So that's the lay of the land. I just got off the plane a little bit ago, and I'd be happy to open it up for questions that you have. Anything that I can be responsive on? Yes, sir.
Congressman, do you think there's a chance that the Democrats here in Illinois will have what I would like to call the audacity to ask for a bailout of the federal pensions, or their own pensions, Illinois? And secondly, what would your response to that be if they did do that?
Well, that's come up in a couple of conversations. There was a footnote in one of President Quinn's budget documents that sort of alluded to the possibility of a federal bailout. I led an effort to get all the Republicans on the congressional delegation, along with the chairman of the appropriate committees in Congress, and they joined a letter to to Governor Quinn, communicating to him that it's a complete non-starter. So the notion of a federal bailout coming to the state of Illinois is simply not going to happen.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was wondering, Congressman, your reaction. During the spring legislative session here in Illinois, 16 Republican members of the Illinois House and Senate voted to allow Cook County to implement parts of Obamacare 2 years early. What are your thoughts on that?
I think really the court is going to be dealing with the health care law within the next several weeks, and this is going to be something that is going to be disposed of largely from a constitutional point of view. And the court's going to make one of three decisions. They're going to uphold the whole law, they're going to strike the whole law down, or something in between, maybe striking down individual mandate or the guarantee issue or something along those lines. So I think it's maybe moving a little bit too quickly to do anything on the implementation side of the new health care law. I wouldn't have voted that way, particularly in light of the fact that it's not a settled constitutional question. Yeah, Terry.
There was some bipartisanship in the House today with the vote on the funding level. Can we expect more in the months to come?
Well, I think there's been some success in the past on a bipartisan basis. That is the Ex-Im Bank and the Food and Drug Administration revisiting some of those regulations, and those are places where people have come together. I think the larger issues, you've got really two competing views of the world, views of the economy largely, that are in play right now. And the irony is, it's essentially the same demographic that sent these two groups to Washington, D.C. and equipped them with very different views. So in other words, in 2008, independent voters gave President Obama their confidence. 24 months later, in the 2010 cycle, that same demographic essentially, I risk overstating, but essentially voted for a check and balance Congress, I would argue. And now those things need to be sorted out. And the November election is, I think, a pivotal election in that you're going to make a decision as a nation in what way you're going to go. You're either going to move into the idea that you're going to continue to try and borrow and spend your way into prosperity, that is the Obama worldview, or a conservative worldview that says, no, look, you have a higher view of the private sector, a higher view really of entrepreneurship, a higher view of risk and reward being related, and we think that that's a winning approach. But on the fringes, there's been some bipartisanship, but at its core, you've got these two very, very different views of the world that are in play.
So it's the same independent group of voters this time around?
Well, yeah, I think independent. So both bases have largely made up their minds and have had their minds made up for the entire Obama presidency. And it will be some number of voters in the middle that are going to make a decision about the direction of the country. Republicans won that vote in 2010, and now Governor Romney and President Obama will be largely competing for that vote. Warner.
Congressman, in the National Defense Authorization Act, there was a lot of PLAs put in there, information to provide for project labor agreements. What is your stance on PLAs?
I guess I'm a little counterintuitive. I look at this as a tool that says if an agency wants to use one of these PLAs to try and put something into place, and it's a tool similar to what Walmart has used or others in the private sector, then fine, let them do it. I don't think it should be a requirement, but nor do I think it should be prohibited.
Representative Roskam?
Yes, sir.
There seems to be an accumulation of big government policies that aren't about budget and welfare, but they are about surveillance and about police powers and about confiscating of private assets, land, even food. And so we're increasingly faced with a government that if there was some kind of bad regime that wanted to try to force something Americans didn't want, hint, hint, that kind of is going on now. Maybe in future years, though, they would be able to hold up an Iron Mountain or wherever they want to go to, and a lot of bad things could be happening by government. And we've even had reports of military and law enforcement personnel given questionnaires as to whether or not they'd be willing to fire on citizens. Whenever there's a new issue that is kind of along those lines, another dot that might be connected, are you interested in connecting those dots? And is there some conversation in Congress about those issues?
Well, there's a constant debate and natural tension, isn't there, that we as a people have had for a long time, and that is trying to navigate through wisely the natural tension between security and liberty. It's an old tension, and it's one where we've been pretty successful in moving through in the past, but we've had success because there's been an awareness on the part of the public that when they have given authority to the government, they've understood that it's a delegated authority and that the public can reclaim it. Winston Churchill gave an unbelievably powerful speech. It was in early September of 1939 when it was clear that the Germans had run into Poland. I think it was September 3rd, 1939, and it was on the floor of the House of Commons. And essentially, he talked about the authority that the government was asking for, and it was a recognition that the authority would be returned at the end of the war. Now we're in a season where our wars are longer, the duration is not as discrete or concrete or definite. And so now you've got a sense of tension about, well, how long do you have this authority? So in answer to your question, yes, these things are being debated robustly. And you will find members of Congress that are spending an extraordinary amount of time, as they should, in briefings trying to understand the subtlety, trying to understand the case law, trying to understand the amendments and what the consequences are of these decisions. And I would argue that that the nature of the debate has been very robust and helpful. And I've been a part of sort of many of these listening sessions trying to get people to a place of common ground where we can move forward. Not giving authority away for the sake of giving it away, but also recognizing that law enforcement needs tools to get a job done.
Well, you posited the idea that we can take that power back that we give government in these areas. How do we do that? Whether it's now or, let's say, a bad thing happens and it's 20 years from now and the Reichstag is burning.
Well, so let me give you an example that's not a Reichstag example, but something that's happening today. And take it out of the national security realm and put it into the government regulation realm. You have many federal agencies right now that are creatures of the people's house. They're creatures of statute. Environmental Protection Agency, Food and Drug Administration, you name it, regulators who are tasked with following up on, enforcing a statute. All right, what's happened, I would suggest, and I think a lot of people agree with this, that they've become out of balance. They are now, so cap and trade is a perfect example. And the question becomes, how can it be that the Environmental Protection Agency is attempting to implement cap and trade by rule when they can't get it through the House of Representatives, or they can't get it through Congress, let's say? That is disjointed, it is out of balance. So what does that look like? What does the reclamation look like? The reclamation looks like Congress moving the REINS Act, Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act, sponsored by Congressman Jeff Davis from Kentucky. And that is to reclaim that authority and to say, look, if there's a regulation that has more than $100 million impact on the economy, it will be reviewed and voted on up or down by Congress. Now, the distinction that needs to be recognized is personal liberty is different than sort of a regulatory freedom, and I recognize that. And I think that there's a sensitivity on the part of most members with whom I've been present as they're navigating through that. But those sorts of limitations, the nature of the conversation or the nature of the hearings that are going on and the oversight function, I think are part of those tools. Yeah.
I had a question about the NDAA. A lot of people are concerned with several sections of the Defense Authorization Act, including Section 1021, which calls for the arrest and detaining of American citizens without trial. What are your thoughts? You voted for the NDAA. Is that something that could take place? Are you concerned about that? And secondly, your thoughts. Homeland Security has been concerned over the last couple of years about domestic extremists. They even wrote a document titled Right-Wing Extremism. Is that something that you've had conversations about with domestic extremism?
I am concerned about the nature of the threat and the changing nature of the threat to our freedom, as is everybody here. So when we've gone through and listened to the nature of the concerns that were raised, they didn't trigger a threshold for me that said that there had been, an abuse of any sort of power over the past 10 years, essentially. So no demonstrable abuse in a decade, which I think speaks volumes. But secondly, also a notion that if somebody is an enemy combatant that has declared themselves an enemy of the United States, then they put themselves into a different category. And I would be the first to acknowledge that there's ambiguity there, but I don't think that we should resolve the ambiguity in their favor. I would resolve the ambiguity in favor on the safety side.
And what about Section 1021 of the NDAA? Is that something that could be...
Get me the details, give me the language of the section, and I can comment with you.
Okay.
Last question.
Yeah.
Congressman, the CFPB, which was created under the Dodd-Frank Act, seems to have given this bureaucracy unlimited power over the financial sector with no oversight by Congress in any way, shape, or form, providing in November that the Republicans were able to gain the House, keep the House, gain the presidency, and get a majority of the Senate. Is there any way that you foresee that we could either repeal or at least rein back in or get some oversight over the CFPB?
I think what you're going to see on a wide range of issues, that included, is a Congress that will come in, work with the Romney administration, and try and directly go towards those things where too much authority has gone to the federal government, or regulations that are based on dogma and nonsense as opposed to really safety and soundness. And there is so much that went through the Congress while Speaker Pelosi was in authority that you almost don't have enough time during the day to get to it all. So that would be one, along with all of the healthcare work, getting into the spending questions, and all of those things, I think, to clean the slate and really get a good foundation where regulation is smart, thoughtful, and makes sense, and isn't just driven by a narrow agenda.
Just to follow up, was there any particular reason the Democrats decided to leave Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, probably the biggest drivers to our financial downfall, out of the Dodd-Frank Act? And
Your
CFPB?
guess is as good as mine. You
And
gotta go to them, as they're fashioning their approach on things. So thanks for your interest, and thanks for coming out. It's good to spend time with you. I'll see you around.